Well, I mean by the term 21st century museum, a museum that's very different from the traditional 19th century museum that many of us are brought up to believe is what museums should be like. So 21st century museum is much more multi-layered than the old traditional idea was, and it's consequently much more popular with more members of the public. It's a more diverse place. That's what I mean by a 21st century museum. In a 21st century museum, I would expect to see lots of collections on show, although I have to say it is entirely possible, I think, to have a modern museum that isn't necessarily rich in beautiful or important objects. It could be quite thin on that, as long as it's strong in other ways, strong on the stories, strong on the ideas, strong on people. So I think a great modern museum has an awful lot of people's experience wrapped up in it. That's the challenge for us all. How do you do that? You can either use collections, or you don't necessarily have to use collections if the collections don't exist and you don't have them. It doesn't stop you from being a great museum. I think that in the modern museum you use all the communication technologies at your disposal. So that certainly means including computer images, films, photographs and so on. What I don't like to see is a museum that is too heavily reliant on computer technology. I think it becomes very dull very quickly. You know, there's no great mystery to most of us nowadays about a computer working and access to internet and so on and so forth. So I don't think museums have to worry overly much about that. Museums, what they have to do is get right the things that they do that nobody else does, which is telling emotional stories by using collections, and that may involve digital technology, but equally I don't think it's that significant. I don't think it's that central. Well, museums have to keep modernising, otherwise we'll become irrelevant, and I think that was a risk that museums ran in the latter part of the 20th century, that they hadn't woken up to the fact that people had lots of experiences on offer. And I think that, therefore, lots of museums lost potential audiences because they didn't work hard enough to get in tune with what people were thinking. So the modern museum today has to keep up with everything that's going on around us. It has to keep up with politics and technology and social change and educational change and so on. It can't just keep presenting collections with stories that were written in the 19th century. I think the main challenges in trying to make a modern museum is that you're involved in controversy quite quickly. You know, we live in a controversial world with instant opinion about everything all over the place, largely courtesy of the internet, but not always. And if museums are going to be part of that world, then they have to be able to cope with controversial issues cropping up. And this is not the traditional role for museums. Traditionally, museums are a refuge from controversy and debate. And I like to think that the modern museum is right at the centre of controversy and debate, and that requires skills that we don't all have. A good museum is lots of different things to lots of different people. You know, the ideal museum rather than the good museum. The ideal museum does have a universal appeal. Whether you're, as I often say, a 95-year-old professor or a 5-year-old child still exploring the world, the museum's got something for you. And I think that all museums can aspire to have widespread appeal. You know, even if you're a museum of old steam engines or something, which you might immediately think, well, that's not going to appeal to everybody. There's always something for everybody in what's going on, whether it's the noises of the engines for young people or a little bit more explanation as to how important this engine is, just beyond the technology. And the problem with the old-fashioned museum is that it tended to concentrate on the technology, and you know, that's of limited appeal. So all the time in a good modern museum, you're looking for the other angles on what you have to say and what you have to show.